Welcome and good morning. My name is Uwe Brandes. I'm professor of practice at Georgetown University and faculty director of the Urban and Regional Planning Program and our university-wide Georgetown Global Cities Initiative. It's my great honor and I'm very excited to be here this morning with you. In the fall of 2023, over the next 3 months, Georgetown University's Global Cities Initiative will be hosting an Urban Thinkers Campus. Many of you, I'm sure, are wondering, what is an Urban Thinkers Campus? The Urban Thinkers Campus is an initiative of the UN Habitat's World Urban Campaign. It is an open space for critical exchange between all stakeholders and partners to promote sustainable urbanization. The Urban Thinkers Campus is a global platform to advocate enlightened planning and design of our cities and propose urban solutions addressing urbanization challenges to urban futures. This fall, the theme of our extended virtual multi-panel global forum, our Urban Thinkers Campus, the theme will be international practices of place management through multi-sector partnerships. This Global Urban Thinkers Campus calls for individuals and organizations to join us in dialogue to explore best practices in place management in cities around the world. The term place management embodies the professional practice of creating multi-stakeholder partnerships to manage and sustain specific urban districts. This Urban Thinkers Campus grows out of sustained research in this subject at Georgetown University and out of the urban renaissance of place management here in our home city of Washington, D.C. Integral to this theme is the concept of creating highly accessible, walkable urban places across our metropolitan landscapes. Also integral is the practice of proactively managing the public realm of a real urban place to be hospitable, safe, attractive, and to rise to the aspirations of serving as a true public commons. We are all familiar with the phrase, think globally, act locally. Our conversation moves beyond acting and embraces practices of active management and the performance management practices associated with continuous incremental improvement. In many urban places around the world, we see an expression of what I would like to call organic subsidiarity. What I mean by that is the expression of place-based and community-based leadership to take on complex problems which are expressed in a local place, but also transcend it. Place management practitioners are confronting much greater complexity and scrutiny associated with the performance of urban places. Are these places accessible by all? How are these places promoting human health and well-being? Are they on a responsible path to decarbonization? Are they adapting to changes in the climate? Are the economies that they host truly equitable? New place-based practices are being forged in response to these complexities. As we embark on an exciting 3 months of discourse and dialogue, together with old colleagues and with new partners, we've posed 3 core research questions to help us structure this conversation. The first is, how do place management organizations serve as the governance vehicle to create place-based partnerships between public, private, and philanthropic sectors? Secondly, how are place management organizations embracing data, research, performance management in the service of advancing their mission? And then finally, how are place management organizations localizing the adoption of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in their ongoing work? I would like to welcome all of our speakers and all of our participants to this virtual kickoff event. I'd also like to formally acknowledge and thank our partner organizations, including the International Downtown Association, the Urban Land Institute, Placemaking X, and the Marin Institute of Urban Management at New York University. I'd like to close with a short explanation of our methodology. We are advancing this Urban Thinkers Campus as a community participatory research project. In this case, our community is not place-based, but rather a global community of professional practice. We've decided to conduct all of our dialogue in an online and virtual format in order to extend this conversation to persons outside of Washington, D.C. And with the exception of standing meetings that we will be conducting with our partners at pre-scheduled events, all of our activities will be virtual. We've scheduled a conclusion to this Urban Thinkers Campus on December 8th, and we hope you will be able to join us then. Following the 8th, we'll prepare a conference report for the UN Habitat Agency. Between today and December 8th, we'll be conducting a series of open roundtable events in various regions and time zones around the world. I welcome and encourage all participants in today's event to join us at any of these roundtable discussions, where we will be exploring specific case studies of innovative practice. All of these activities will be documented on the Georgetown Global Cities Initiative website. So let's start. Let's jump into our first session with my colleague, Professor Sheila Foster of Georgetown University.
Hi, Sheila, welcome. We're really excited for you to join this conversation.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks. Sheila, you've really recently written about the shift in urban discourse from a focus on government to the concept of governance. And can you describe the shift and share with us a little bit of the factors associated with place and place-based engagement in cities, and how those place-based activities are helping to inform this shift in emphasis?
Sure. What I've written about is my observation that there are a variety of place-based multi-actor or multi-sector governance arrangements that have taken root in different kinds of cities, both in the US and abroad. And by governance, I mean that if we think about government, it's a central authority that controls everything, very closely held. Everything comes from within government. But these arrangements have a governance feature that involves a mix of different sectors or actors that are making the decision and are stewarding or shepherding a development or project. They could be public and private sectors, they could be public, private, community, and university sectors. So there's a range of them, but the idea of governance is that it's different configurations of actors in a non-centralized way that have control and decision-making authority over the development of a particular place.
And would you describe this? Certainly, I think we hope to really discover and explore the diversity of this, but would you describe this as a larger trend? Talk a little bit about place as an organizing factor in governance.
So there are parts of it that I think are a trend, in particular, the way these things are empowered or enabled, the funding, the sources of funding, but in many ways, we've always had place-based governance, at least in the United States. And that goes back to some forms of federal government money that can enable people to take care of parks, for instance, or state and local government money and federal money to create community development organizations that develop parts of cities in particular. So if you go back to the history of place-based organizations or placemaking, I think you see there's a long history. But I think what's really, and I wouldn't even say it a trend, but the development of that over time of place making or place-based governance, let's say over time, has changed. And that's a large part of what I write about, both in terms of the variety or the spectrum of place-based activities and organizations, but also the funding and the legal authority that they're given.
Yeah. In your most recent essay in the book Hyperlocal, you talk about the difference between place making and place management. And I think in general, place making as a term is very widely accepted, and there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement around activation of the public realm. But in place management, there is an approach that encompasses both, public space and the public sector of the city, but also the private. And I'm wondering if you could kind of help distinguish between the two, this idea of activities just focused on the public realm, and urban districts that include both public and private spaces, and really just introducing this concept of property into the framework of urban places.
Sure. So one distinction you've mentioned is that when we refer to placemaking, we often refer to things that happen in public spaces. They could be squares, they could be parks, they could be neighborhood streets. So we saw that during the pandemic, right? We closed streets to cars and people came together and really created and made spaces for social life and for commerce, etc. But in a space that they didn't really have any formal authority over, right? The government still has all the control, all of the property entitlements, right? The minute the government says you can't do this anymore, the government is essentially the owner, usually the local government. And so the government's very much in control. When we think about place management or governance, there's been some relinquishment of either formal control of the space, the property. So think about vacant lots, for instance, that are transferred to someone else, or even streets sometimes that are privatized, that are given to a neighborhood or development. And so they're collectively, so if you live in a gated community, right, that community governs the streets and also has ownership, collective ownership. So governance is really, has both a decision-making feature and a legal feature, which is to say, you're making decisions, this collection of people is making decision, or has the authority to make decisions about what happens with this space. But also often there's some transfer of property entitlement or right to that space. So for instance, we see with business improvement districts, for instance, right? Those are usually state level laws that give local businesses operating in an area authority over usually public spaces, streets. So there's a governance feature, but it's also a public space. But we also see areas in cities that, let's say, are old industrial areas that need to be redeveloped. And we see some cities giving both the property and the authority to decide how to develop that property, and sometimes authority to raise money and tax on the basis of that property. And that's really the shift to governance, right? And the only question is, who are the actors involved? Who has that control? What level of control? And what does the local government that represents us all, does the public, let's say, qua public, not the public sector per se, but all of us who live in a place, do we have any stake, right, in that governance arrangement? And so that's really, I think, the distinction is that governance looks a lot more capacious than government. We know what government it is, but sometimes we don't always understand who's part of this governance arrangement.
Yeah, I want to drill down into the issue of stakeholders and stakeholder engagement in a few minutes. But before we do, I want to just continue to explore the issues associated with the kind of public good in cities. And you have thought a lot and you've written a lot about the idea of cities as part of the commons. Can you just bring us into the thinking around cities as commons, and how does that work? Is that a literal idea of, public spaces being the commons, or is it extend to other ways of thinking about the built environment and local communities?
Absolutely. So that's a very good question. So traditionally, we think about commons as natural resources or public spaces that really no one owns, and usually the government holds in trust and we can access them. That's not the way that myself and my co-author have worked up that idea of city as commons. It really does span all kinds of infrastructure in cities, including private infrastructure and public. And the idea is that cities are a common resource in the sense that how we understand and experience cities are part of a collective endeavor by all of us. That is to say, we're all part of the vibe of a city, the street culture of a city, etc. And so the culture can be a commons in that sense, in that it's collectively created and produced. In the same way, the city as a commons, in the way that I've used it, and my co-author and I have used it in our work, is to say that we can take the infrastructure of the city, buildings, land, public and private spaces, and collectively create the kind of goods and services that people who live there need, whether that's new kinds of housing, or new kinds of green space, or sometimes we can create mesh networks to connect people who don't have access to the internet by simply connecting points on buildings that people are in, all the way to energy communities that we can put solar on a building that we don't live on and all kind of share in that solar panel. But the idea is openness, that the parts of the city that aren't overly privatized, in particular, that are not kind of all owned by one person, or one entity, and there's a lot of cities that are not, including vacant, abandoned, underutilized land that we should be able collectively in places, and here's where it comes back to place-based governance and placemaking, that we should collectively be able to have access to those spaces or that infrastructure to create new goods. So we see that with community gardens again. You know, in the 70s and 80s in many cities, there was lots of vacant land and people came together and created these wonderful gardens to provide them not just with fresh food, but recreational space with safe space, eyes on the street. And we see it now in much more sophisticated forms, community land trusts, urban land trusts, limited equity kinds of organizations that take utilize in underdeveloped spaces. The Bridge Project in Washington, D.C. is an example of that.
I just want to add another question in here around kind of governance and systems and the commons, because you have just pointed to a number of really interesting new forms of either new expressions of the commons and also new forms of governance associated with some, you know, clean energy systems in cities, just as one example. So one of the really exciting things about place is that it represents a confluence of so many different systems that totally kind of add up to representing the city. How do you reconcile systems governance with place? And I think just, you know, kind of a simple example, of course, would be like an energy utility. That's a systems based form of governance, but also serves individual places across the city. So there's a kind of a tension there between place and citywide systems. I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the kind of governance implications of that.
So that's a very good question. And by that, I take that it's kind of trying to get at what are the incentives for people that have control over the systems, our social systems, our utility systems, you know, our housing systems, and our land systems to ever give up any of that control to really work in a meaningful way with place-based actors. They could be residents, they could be businesses, and a constellation of folks to create these new forms of placemaking and place governance. And there is a tension there, because whether it's the local government itself that is reluctant to share all of the spaces or the buildings that are not in use, for instance, and that haven't been, if you think about Detroit and right in some other cities, that there's so much available land and buildings, but you know, governments often put them in land banks and they sit underutilized. Or you have legacy actors. They could be, you know, the people that provide our broadband or electricity. And even though everyone's not being reached, some people want to work with those companies to create new forms of place-based systems. They could be a community broadband network, or again, a community solar project, in which you need the utility to agree to rebate some of the energy savings back to the consumers, right? And so you need both a legal enabling environment, a law to be able, that's called net metering, but also you need the utilities to want to do that. And there is tension because often legacy actors or people who have control over governments, who have control over the system, don't want to let go because they think there's maybe other kinds of development or other kinds of project that may net more of a payoff, not particularly for that community, but for the entire system or city. So what's interesting about these place-based arrangements that have now taken root is that they involve these legacy actors, right, who are partnering with different sectors, civic sector, private, public, and knowledge sectors, let's say, as well as local governments. And they're doing that for a number of reasons, which we can talk about. But I think we are seeing a lot more nimbleness in the system around some kinds of placemaking, not all. I don't want to give the impression like it's there's low-hanging fruit, because there rarely is, but it's happening. And one question was, why is it happening?
So let's drill down now into stakeholders, and we can think about and approach the conversation about stakeholders from a pure perspective of inclusion, right? But I'd also like you to reflect a little bit on like the process of governance design. A lot of the folks and people who will be participating in this conversation over the course of the fall are people who are also working to create new place-based management organizations. So talk a little bit about, and we've talked about the diversity of organizations. There's a plethora of different kinds of place management organizations. Talk a little bit, I guess, first conceptually about how stakeholders are involved in governance, and then maybe if you can talk a little bit about like the design process. How do you design governance?
Yeah, so again, another very good question. As you know, I've written a recent book in addition to the hyperlocal chapter or the chapter in that book on co-cities, where we've thought a lot about the design, the process of collaboration, not just engagement. We have a lot of participatory systems in which government calls the public forward, or an agency to get the input of the people that it affects most. But when you're talking about creating these governance structures, you need more than participation. You need buy-in, and you need stakeholders, and even I think shareholders, people who think of themselves not just as having a stake, but ultimately maybe having a share in the outcome. They're benefiting, not just at the front end, but at the back end. And that's the key to how you get people involved, I think, is that, and it's different for different actors, but one of the things we thought about is what we call a cycle, in which you start with how do you bring the different actors together in a particular place that you need to pull together to create a new place, to redevelop, or to create a new kind of model of housing or energy system. You often need actors or stakeholders that don't really talk to each other. So it's identifying the interests that the people on the ground, let's say the community, has, and the other people that can help make that happen, and to begin to start a low stakes conversation, what we've called cheap talk, and which is a term that comes from Eleanor Ostrom, who's written about governing common resources, is low stakes engagement. Can we identify the things that we all have in common? And then next, can we begin to work together on something low stakes, right? It could be a prototype of something that we all might benefit from, that the private sector would be willing to invest in. And when I say private sector, I don't mean large corporations like an Amazon or Google that aren't connected to the place. I'm really talking about private sectors, organizations or businesses that are in this place. So you think about, so let me give a university. An example of a university. Like, for instance, University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which has created, with the authority of the local government and the state, a university city district to revitalize a part of Philadelphia that was underdeveloped, underinvested in, and needed some real investment and attention, both for underinvested communities in the area, but also Penn had an interest, because in part Penn can't pick up and leave. The same thing with Columbia University in New York, expanding into communities that have not always benefited from its presence. So in that case, those anchor institutions, but it could also be a hospital, or those folks are part of the community. They have an interest, right? And if you can get them to see the community's interest, and also get them to agree that the community should have more than a participatory role, but almost a stewardship role I think that's the huge hurdle. So there's a cycle, I think, of creating collaboration that we thought about. I won't go into depth, but I do think you have to think. I love that you called it a design process, because in many respects, it is a matter of how you design a process. There are lots of pitfalls, but that will allow you to pivot and be nimble in bringing and pooling. So we also talk about pooling economies and pooling the kinds of actors and resources ultimately to create new kinds of place governance and places ultimately.
So thank you for that, Sheila. Just to close out, you know, the set of research questions that we're using to help structure this conversation, you know, explore place, explore the management practices associated with place, and we're asking about the public good, and specifically the advancement of the SDGs. What kind of issues or questions should we keep at the forefront of our conversation as we proceed this fall?
Right. So I do want to come back to this issue of design. One, I think, research question is, who do these arrangements ultimately benefit, right? Whether place management, place governance arrangements result in sustainable development or meet the SDGs or result in inclusive development, and whether the benefits are shared widely, particularly with the most vulnerable and marginal stakeholders or communities, depend on how these arrangements are structured or designed. So that's one thing I've written about. One useful distinction I've made is between top-down and bottom-up arrangements, right? Those that are driven mostly by large or corporate anchor institutions, right, that initiate a project and then may invite the residents and civic sector along. And a bottom-up approach where those large actors follow the lead of civic organizations or place-based groups and provide support in a truly collaborative way. And I think that remains a research question, because there's a spectrum, a lot of different ways in which these things are structured that have not been closely studied, and we don't have a lot of empirical work or case studies on them. And in part, the book that you mentioned, Hyperlocal, is designed, as well as our Co-City book, to begin to bring some of those examples forward.
Sheila, thank you so much for helping us start this conversation. So great to see you.
Good to see you too.